You should all be able to see my slide. Start off with, I want to explain why we thought we'd go down this route of making detailed polling on attitudes towards nuclear. Basically, we saw there was this lack of confidence in the nuclear industry, and the industry was worried about what the public was thinking, and therefore politicians and investors were also worried. And after the energy crisis, a lot of the public opinion was actually very positive towards nuclear. And it'd be important for the nuclear industry to share that with politicians, investors itself. And what we saw in existing surveys is they suffered often on these three key areas. Either they were isolated, they just look at one country, one energy, or 1 year, not be regular. Or they were limited in their insights. They weren't able to answer the questions of lots of different stakeholders. What do politicians want to know? What does the nuclear industry want to know? What do investors want to know? And finally, muted impact. There's surveys that get done, no one sees them, no one reads them. There's no sort of action-oriented nature to them. So those are the three areas we wanted to focus on. Here we thought of when pitching the idea to ourselves, sort of instead of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the sort of nuclear hierarchy of confidence. First, you got to be confident in the physics. Can nuclear energy be that energy that is clean, abundant, low cost? And then you got to get the public on board with that idea. Only once you've got the public on board is the nuclear industry able to start building, and governments able to finance that, and finally those banks too able to finance it. But the sort of public perception is an important building block. It's much harder to build stuff without public perception. We then did a review of all the existing surveys, big surveys we saw out there. This is a small sample of them. And as you can see with the sort of green highlighting, there's a lot of gaps. Often big gap is not being a survey that compares across lots of different countries. And the importance of being able to compare across countries is finding out which countries are doing it well, which countries are speaking to their public about nuclear energy in a way that is effective, and that other countries can learn from. Another area that a lot of them suffer from is comparing across different energies. This sort of column here. It's important to know, yes, nuclear might be unpopular, but how does that compare with other clean energy sources that we're looking to build? If the government wants to be building biomass and gas with carbon capture, surely it should also be looking to build nuclear if nuclear is more popular than those. So to give you an overview of what we're looking to achieve with this report, it's a sort of standardized survey across countries, across different energies, and throughout time, offer a detailed understanding of what the public wants to every stakeholder out there. And finally, make it action focused, have this data be there to be used such that the nuclear industry can improve and be the nuclear industry that people want it to be. If you improve public perception towards nuclear, that just means everyone's happier with nuclear. And that's something the industry should aim for, not in a way of manipulating people, but just be better at what they do. So that's what we're hoping to achieve with this report. Highlight the areas where the nuclear industry needs to improve, how it can achieve that. So next up, let's show you the report. So you can find the report on the website, our website, rageandenergygroup.com, and the PDF there that you can download, look in your own time. But here's the report. I took great pleasure in this opening image, which, it's semi-artistic, but to give you an overview of what we were looking to do with this image, the darker areas are the regions of the world where there's a lot of nuclear, the lighter areas less so. So America, Europe, with the exception of Germany in the middle, has a lot of nuclear, China, South Korea, Japan too. So just a bit of artistic fun. This report touches on 4 key topics. So I'm actually going to skip the executive summary because we don't need to go through that. We'll cover all of that as we go through the full report. So here you've got a view of the sort of opening page of charts. And what we've got here is a view of public support and opposition. Support on the right, opposition on the left. And what you see is the top of this chart, the countries with the most support. It's China, Russia, United Arab Emirates, India. In these countries, there's almost 4 times more supporters than opposers to nuclear energy. And that's sort of world leading. And a big thought we had here is, why is it that these countries have so much more public support than developed countries? So overall, here's a little comparison of the G7, the global 7, US, UK, France, Italy, Germany, Japan, and maybe one other that I've forgotten, Canada, versus BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. And these developing countries consistently show higher support for nuclear. And a theory we've got is it's the countries that are growing the fastest, that have had electricity growth grow quickly. They're the countries that support continued economic and electric growth. And it's the countries, often developed countries, that aren't growing as quickly, that aren't as keen for growth. And what exemplifies this best is, if we look at the next slide, here we're comparing net support for nuclear to that of the other clean energy options we've surveyed. So to explain what we've done here, so in China, there is 61% in support of nuclear, 15% in opposition, which is 46% overall in net support. So those supporting minus those opposing. And in China, it's 46% net support. Wind and solar is up plus over 75% net support. And nuclear support is sort of similar levels to gas with carbon capture, biomass from trees. What we see here, which is interesting, is in these BRICS developing countries, all energy sources are more supported than in the G7. So it's not only nuclear is more supported, but it's also wind, solar, gas, biomass. And I think that ties in with this techno-optimist view that we see in developing countries, that they just want everything. They want a better quality of life. They want to live a world of abundant energy. And that's what's driving their public support. There'll be other dynamics going on too. China, Russia, not the most democratic of nations. Maybe that has something to do with it. But yeah, there's sort of a whole host of reasons, which we'll get into. One thing when looking at this, how does nuclear compare to other clean energy sources that stood out? There's only one country out of the 20 we surveyed where nuclear was more popular than onshore wind. And that one is Norway here, which you can go on our data tables. The net support for wind is actually way down near the level of. And it's interesting that in Norway, they've got more support for nuclear, even though they don't have nuclear power stations. They still support nuclear more than they do onshore wind. And that ties in with cultural reasons in the country. I think they care a lot about their environment, and more than others countries. And so again, I'd say Norway has that techno-optimist view. They've managed to transform the country of oil and gas wealth, and there's this new wave of techno-optimism towards nuclear energy. Next up, we asked the public, what of these 5 clean energy sources is your preferred source, the one that you think your country should focus on? And there's different ways of interpreting how this should be used. One way is, which energy source does the public think is underinvested in at the moment, therefore needs focusing on? The second, more obvious answer is, which is their preferred source of energy? And that first potential answer helps policymakers, governments decide, all right, where does our public want us to focus our attention on? The second reading is, if you're an energy provider, utility provider, should you be including tariffs that cater to nuclear? That's a big focus that we want to see around the world. In many countries, you get 100% wind and solar tariffs, but it's rare to see nuclear tariffs out there. But what our data shows is around the world, 25% of the public thinks their country should focus on nuclear. There is a large share of the public that has a preference for nuclear. And therefore, if utilities are ever considering, oh, do we want to have a nuclear only tariff or a nuclear plus renewables tariff, they can feel reassured that there's a large to the public that has strong support and strong preference for nuclear. Next up, we took this view, but instead of looking at all 20,000 respondents, we just look at I think it was about a third of respondents that were positive on wind, solar, and nuclear. So think of these respondents as technology neutral in their approach to tackling climate change. If it's a green technology that nuclear, wind, solar are, they want to build it. They support them all. Amongst those technology neutral public, in every country, that preference for nuclear grows. So a way that a politician could read this is, amongst the cohort of my public that understands that all of these clean energies are to be supported if we want to transition to net zero, the ones that they want me to focus on, the ones they want their country to focus on, is overwhelmingly nuclear and solar, for what it's worth. So globally, 36% of these technology neutral members of the public want to focus on nuclear, 31% want to focus on large-scale solar farms, 15% on onshore wind. So we could have surveyed pretty much every country out there with our survey providers, but we settled on 20. It's what our budget got us to. And within that 20, there's the 15 biggest nations for nuclear electricity generation. And there's also the G7, the BRICS countries, and a few other strategic countries that we thought were considering nuclear, but needing that public support to be shown to them. So that was Norway, Italy and BRICS, Philippines and Australia. The one exception to what I said the 15 largest nuclear nations, there was Ukraine is one of those 15, but we weren't able to do the survey in Ukraine for obvious reasons. Hopefully that's something we'll be able to fix in this 2024 survey that will be coming out later in the year, at the end of the year. A follow-up question is, why did we choose these 5 clean energies? So we've got nuclear, large-scale solar farms, onshore wind farms, biomass from trees, gas with carbon capture. So what we wanted is to compare what we saw as the 5 clean energies that were land-based, so excluding offshore wind. Land-based therefore have to deal with NIMBYism and those dynamics, and also land-based therefore relevant to every country. You know, a landlocked country isn't going to be able to build offshore wind. Secondly, we wanted what energy is considered as clean by governments. So some people don't consider biomass from trees clean or gas with carbon capture, CCS, as clean, but many governments do, and therefore we wanted that to be a comparison point. Secondly, we've excluded hydropower for the reason that a lot of countries can't build it. For all intents and purposes, it's maxed out in many countries. I think across the OECD, the sort of developed countries, there's not been any growth in hydropower. So if we felt little need to survey on hydropower. And finally, there's geothermal, tidal, wave energy, which are all important, but too small a scale for us to have considered. And finally, again, there's here we're looking at large-scale solar farms. There's also rooftop solar. We've not looked at rooftop solar because that's more of a a personal decision that doesn't get impacted by national policy, by big industry, by NIMBYs. So we want to focus on that large scale solar that does get impacted by policy and NIMBY actually. So that gives a review of why we've chosen our 20 countries, why we've chosen the 5 different clean energy sources. Good. Next, we're in the second section of our report around energy attributes. Started off with asking people, they had 3 choices of what are the most important things they want from their energy. What we expected to see is people would care most about the energy trilemma. We expected to see people want reliable electricity that tackles climate change and is low cost. What was interesting to see is the average across the 20 countries, health and safety actually features super high. I'm from the UK, where health and safety was a lot less important. So I had that bias that health and safety maybe doesn't matter as much as the energy trilemma. But across the world, health and safety is really important of what people want from their electricity. What was interesting to see again is the all-in cost. So I think we got the actual wording of the question here. So all-in cost referred to cost of infrastructure and the cost to consumer. And that got sort of little vote for sort of most important energy attributes. I think a reason why we thought that might be is people accept the cost is maybe out of their control, or the cost will be competitive no matter what. There's a few theories that we had to that, but yeah, it was reassuring to see that reliability and the ability to tackle climate change was the most important. Other things of interest, I think Germany was the country that's ranked cost the highest. 36% of Germans saw all-in cost as one of their key criteria they wanted from energy. That might be because in Germany, electricity prices have risen fast, and are very high, and therefore they care a lot about it. And in the UK, self-sufficiency was very important. UK is an island. We've always cared about self-sufficiency. It was interesting to see that we care more about that than others. There'll be other insights you'll be able to find from this. And next up, we asked people, what do they think about nuclear performance against these energy attributes? So first off, reliability. This is the public's most important energy criteria. Across the 20 countries surveyed, 2/3 see nuclear as reliable, either fairly reliable or very reliable. And that's really reassuring that the public's most important energy attribute is one that nuclear rates highly on. Second off is health and safety. As you can imagine, that's always been an issue of nuclear energy. It's public perception around health and safety. And again, we see that in most countries, that public perception around health and safety is pretty negative. Across the world, 80% of the public is concerned or very concerned about the health and safety implications of nuclear. What's interesting is Sweden and Norway are leading the way in positive public perception around safety. And that's in Norway, which doesn't yet have any nuclear power stations. They've still got that slightly more positive perception than other countries. And a theory we have as to why that is in Sweden, where they have nuclear power stations, they are run well. The public has trust in their nation and their regulator and their nuclear operators, and that trust carries over to a more positive perception. So the more the public trust their government, the more the public can trust nuclear safety. So that's a theory as to why those countries do so well. Next off, emissions. As one of the key tenets of the energy transition, at least in the developing world, is we're doing it to get clean energy. And therefore, it's really important that nuclear is seen as that clean, low carbon energy. Disappointingly, across the G7, almost 50% of the public don't see nuclear as clean. They see it as emitting a great deal or a fair amount of greenhouse gases. And I think if we want to take a step back, I think from all of this polling data, what's the one key message we need to push? In my view, it's this, that in a energy transition where clean energy is important to the public, it's one of their top 3 criteria. The fact that nuclear isn't yet seen as clean is a big red flag, and it's where our attention should be focused on. As we'll see later, in the health and safety aspect, there is a lot of concern around nuclear's health and safety, but amongst those that are concerned about the health and safety of nuclear, there's still a majority that support it, which suggests that safety isn't the be-all and end-all for nuclear support, but actually perceptions around whether the nuclear is low carbon or not have a big sway on whether people are supportive of nuclear or not. So the big focus should be, when speaking to the public, nuclear is low carbon, is a solution to climate change. That should be the key message that we share with the public when speaking about nuclear. Next, we got waste, very similar story to what we saw in health and safety. I think there's a bit of analysis that we're doing which suggests that people those that are concerned about one are often concerned about the others. They're often grouped together. Next off, this one was really interesting, and around whether people perceive nuclear as able to lower their electricity bills on the right, or would use of nuclear increase their electricity bills. One thing we saw is there's a lot more don't knows in this than in other areas, and that's understandable. The impact of wind, nuclear, solar on your electricity bills is hard to understand. There's many dynamics going on, even the experts trip up along the way. So those that do express their opinion, it's I guess a gut feel. And it's interesting to see that in developing nations, in the G7, that gut feel is nuclear is able to reduce their energy bills much more than it would raise them. And that's not the case in developing countries. Equally interesting, in admittedly only 4 non-nuclear countries, but right at the top, Italy, Norway, and Philippines are the ones that have the most net positive perception of nuclear's ability to reduce their energy bills. And this might be a case of people wanting all of the above. In countries that don't have nuclear, the way they want their energy mix to be is to be a mix. And they think if you have a mix of lots of different clean energies, they complement each other. When the sun isn't there, you've got nuclear as backup. When the wind isn't there, you can have gas with carbon capture as backup. In these countries, maybe there's a focus on let's have a mix. And if there's an element of that mix that they don't have, they want it. They think it will reduce their energy bills. Yeah, so we've got right at the top Sweden, but also Japan, Germany, and South Korea. These 4 countries had a somewhat politically mandated nuclear phase out or phase down. And in those countries, nuclear is seen as able to reduce their electricity bills. But we'll get onto it later. What's really interesting is in those 4 countries, nuclear is seen as the best, is most often seen as the right technology for reducing electricity bills, more so than wind, solar, or other clean energy options. But we'll get onto that, well, right now. Actually, I'll jump straight to the cost line. So here, these countries, we've got Sweden and where we go, Germany, Japan, and South Korea here. And I use South Korea as an example. Net perception of whether nuclear is able to reduce their electricity bills is top. It's first. So nuclear is seen as the best energy to reduce their energy bills, seen as a positive source of low-cost energy by more people than wind, solar, biomass, or gas. And that's the case. The other countries that where nuclear ranks first are Sweden, South Korea, Germany, and Japan. So countries that have experienced a nuclear phase out, they are the ones that appreciate the value that nuclear provided to their electricity. And once nuclear's gone, they miss it. They miss their low electricity price that they had, and they want it back. If we rewind quickly to reliability, this was a really interesting one. What we expected is people would see nuclear as more reliable than wind or solar, but that's not what we saw. What we saw is across the world, people often rate wind and solar as more reliable than nuclear. And I think that the big question here is what does the word reliable mean to different people? To us on this call, reliability might mean intermittency. But to the average person, reliability might mean other things. It might mean, is that energy option able to produce energy when you want it? And for all intents and purposes, wind and solar, they rarely don't work when they're able to work. It's not when wind and solar aren't producing electricity, it's not that the infrastructure isn't working, is that the weather isn't playing ball. It's not the wind and solar that is unreliable, but it's the weather that's unreliable. So the takeaway I'd have from this is when speaking to the public about reliability, be clear with what you mean. Make clear that there's different types of reliability. Where nuclear excels is it's not intermittent. It's able to produce electricity when you want it. So yeah, reliability can mean different things to different people. Next up on emissions, again, as I mentioned earlier, emissions super important in this net zero transition, that people see nuclear as low carbon. And that's not the case at the moment. So there's not a majority that see nuclear as low carbon. What is encouraging is in many countries, nuclear is seen as lower carbon than biomass and gas carbon capture and storage. So when, the other two firm energy sources, nuclear is seen as low carbon. More people see nuclear as low carbon than those other energy sources. Great. Next up, this is the section around demographic breakdowns. And I think this is quite a fun section because you get to put your preconceptions as to what people think to the test. And first up, age. So to explain how this graph works, if we take Russia example, the darker dots mean the older demographics, the lighter dots mean the younger demographics. And on the scale of right to left, we've got net support. So if your dot is on this hard black line, that means that 100% of that demographic likes nuclear. There's no one that opposes it, no one that doesn't know. And equally, if you're on the left, that's sort of more opposition than support. So what we see across the world is generally older demographics are more supportive of nuclear than younger demographics. There's a few big outliers there. One that I saw the other day was Norway, where actually it's maybe hard to see on the shared screen, but it's actually the youngest demographic of 18 to 24-year-olds that are most supportive. And what you really want, I think, for what the nuclear industry should be aiming for is for all ages to be supportive. But if you can get the younger demographics most supportive, that sees you out in a good way in the long term, because it's that younger demographic that's going to be in the positions of power in the future. And it's for them that you're building this new clean energy infrastructure. So it's important that nuclear is able to promote itself towards that young demographic. You may ask, why is it that older people are generally more supportive? There's a few theories as to why that is. I think one view I've got is around the idea of perfect is enemy of the good. And when you're young, it might be that you want the perfect energy source. And you look at nuclear and you see there's a few blemishes. It's not the perfect energy source you want. Whereas older, arguably wiser demographics realize that actually I'm happy with good enough when it comes to energy transition. If it's clean, I don't mind about any concerns I've got about safety or waste. Also, those older demographics, they've lived longer. They've seen the ups and downs of the nuclear industry. They've had maybe more time to do their research, to find out about, what was the safety implications of Fukushima and Chernobyl. So that might drive that demographic split. There's also education. Who knows what the education system is in these schools in all these 20 countries? It might be that some countries are more pro-nuclear in their education than others, and that's changed over time. Next up, big demographic split around gender. And in every country we looked at, men were more supportive of nuclear than women. And what was interesting to see is we looked at what that demographic split looked like in wind and solar, and it didn't exist in wind and solar. It was much, much narrower. It's really in nuclear that this stark demographic split, and that matters because in Belgium, say you've got 50% net support for nuclear amongst the men, policymakers might be like, yes, let's build it. But that's not representative of what women in the country think. In Belgium and all the countries left of this hard black line, women have net opposition towards nuclear. So building nuclear could go against what the majority of women think in a sort of undemocratic way, as far as those women would be concerned. So it's important to narrow that gap. And there's a large body of reasons why this might be. I think to give us a high view of why that might be, I think there's one view that they like big, manly infrastructure, and nuclear is seen as that sort of a big, hard solution to their energy mix. Whereas women might have different priorities, might care about different energy attributes. The flip side is men might be, well, what we see is men are more often confident in their knowledge about nuclear than women, but that might often be misplaced. It might be that men think, oh, I've read this one article once that says nuclear is great, therefore I support it. Whereas women take a bit more time to read lots of literature to really build their base of support. So there's various reasons why this might be, and it's something we're looking at Radiant to dig into deeper with time, and we're working with women in nuclear to find out what are these drivers that differentiate men's support amongst men with women. We've got a few more demographic splits. We asked people whether they thought they knew a lot about how nuclear works or nothing at all. And as you can imagine, or it's not quite as you can imagine, but what was encouraging to see is pretty much universally across all 20 countries, those that did know or did think they knew a lot about how nuclear works support it more. And that's encouraging. The more that you learn about nuclear, the more that you support it. And we did the same analysis with wind and solar, and it wasn't quite as clear cut. For wind and solar, sometimes it'd be the case that those that said they knew a lot about how those technologies worked actually had slightly more opposition to wind and solar than those that didn't know much about. Another way to read this graph is the sort of lightest don't know how nuclear works dot. You could kind of see that as the default position in that country. So in the UK, someone that's never interacted with nuclear, they just read the paper, see what the general sentiment in the country is, but don't have any idea, any grounds to make their decision other than what they've read. they're basing their decision of what the public mood is, or what they see it as. So this gives an idea of, the importance of education around how nuclear energy works, but also gives a view as to how split a country can be with the way that nuclear is perceived amongst the masses that understandably don't know how nuclear energy works, and those that do. Next, we've got two different demographic breakdowns. One is around whether people are concerned about climate change, and the next is whether people are supporters of environmental organizations like Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, and I think that there was another anti-nuclear one that we gave as an example. And what's interesting to see here is across the G7 developed countries, those that are most concerned about climate change in dark green are least supportive of nuclear. And that's not the case in BRICS developing countries. So in these developed countries, top of that list is Germany, Spain, Sweden, Belgium, Japan, Australia. Those that are most climate concerned are least supportive of nuclear. And on the next slide, we see a reason why that might be. So in dark green, we've got those that say self-identify as being a member of an environmental organization. And again, in those same countries, Belgium, Germany, Sweden, France, those that are members of environmental organizations are less supportive. So it might be that in these Western nations, people who are most concerned about climate change then join an environmental non-profit such as Greenpeace. And while in that environmental non-profit, get brought up with the idea that nuclear isn't the solution to climate change and they should be focusing on other technologies. And it might be that these environmental organizations are detracting from nuclear support in those countries. Whereas that isn't as much the case in developing countries. What we see is in these BRICS developing nations, the green dot is higher than the light green dot. Those that are members of environmental organizations are more supportive of nuclear. Next demographic divide, we've got final one actually, is around political splits. So each dot represents how big the party is in support. And what you'd want if you were the nuclear industry deciding which country do we want to build in is, your power plant is going to take 10 years to build and is going to be there for 50 years. You want the country you build in to have the main parties, so not only the largest party, not only the party that's in power now, but a mix of the top 4 parties for their voters to be all on the same page, all as supportive of nuclear as one another. And that's not the case in Germany, South Africa, Australia. In these countries, there's a big partisan divide between in nuclear support. So that's going to detract from any sort of long-term build of nuclear in those countries because investors are worried about the political risk. Another way that we can present this is, instead of looking at party size, we can look at left and right divide of parties. What we see in the G7, so the developed countries, is generally those that are more economic right-wing are more supportive of nuclear than those left-wing. And a few reasons why this might be. It might be, again, linked into that environmental non-profit view. Those on the left wing more likely to be members of Greenpeace and other environmental orgs and get that anti-nuclear sentiment. But it could also be that, oh, sorry, my dog's barking. Those on the right wing are more sort of techno-optimist in their outlook of energy. And that's what drives their support. Few rationale behind it. What was interesting to see that bucked this trend was in South Africa. It was actually the left wing was much more supportive than right wing. And one anecdotal reason that was given for this was that the left wing cared more for low-cost, reliable energy than right-wing voters, but also right-wing voters more often were aligned with Western views of Western environmental views. Final few slides before I open up to questions. We, instead of asking people about support and opposition, we also want to ask them more policy directed question. Do people want to build reactors with or without subsidies? Do they want to keep their existing reactors but not build any more? Or do they want to phase out and ban all reactors, as was done in Germany? What was encouraging to see is something like 3.5 times more people around the world wanted to keep their reactors online than take them off, and 2 times more wanted to build more reactors than ban existing reactors. I think this is a much more useful metric for policymakers. There's a lot of people that we saw slightly oppose nuclear, but still wanted to keep using nuclear. And support opposition gives you an idea of, how people feel, but not how they want you to act. And this is a much more action-oriented question. Another follow-on action-oriented question we wanted was to focus towards the clean energy investment community. At the moment, nuclear is excluded from green investments. And the reason most often given is fear of investor backlash. Big banks don't want their investors to pull out. They want to only include nuclear if investors want it. What we found when asking the public is actually the public would prioritize clean investments that include nuclear than prioritize ones that exclude nuclear. So anyone in the banking world, clean investments should take note. Final slide here is on how does perception of these different energy attributes affect support? So first off, reliability. Only 25% of people didn't see nuclear as reliable, but amongst those that didn't see nuclear as reliable, so opposition was 4 times higher than those that saw it as reliable. Then health and safety, the way to read this is the majority, 80%, are concerned about nuclear safety. But within that majority that is concerned about safety, there's still a majority that support nuclear. 40% who are concerned about nuclear safety still support it. So check, yeah, and then there's methodology there. So that sums up the report. You can also find the executive summary, so all the key findings here with nice interactive graphs. This is all on our website. At the bottom of our webpage, you've got a link to that PDF and also a link to the Excel data tables.